At first, archaeology feels simple. There is earth, and there are hands. There is time, and there is patience. Someone kneels in the dust, brushing sand away from a shape that has not felt light for centuries. Stone appears, then metal, then something fragile, half-broken, whispering of another life. The moment is quiet and careful, almost intimate. Nothing is rushed, nothing is forced. The past seems willing to return. We are taught that this is how history works. It waits. We find it. We preserve it. We tell its story. But this is only part of what happens. Because not everything that is found is carried forward. Not everything that enters the light stays there. Some discoveries arrive with a soft excitement, a brief glow of attention, and then something strange occurs. They begin to fade. Not dramatically, not with protest or denial. They simply grow quieter. They are cited less, discussed less, taught less, until one day they feel unfamiliar again, even to those who once held them. It is not that they are rejected. Rejection is loud. It leaves marks. It leaves arguments behind. These discoveries are not pushed away. They are allowed to drift. A dig report is published, then not followed. A promising line of inquiry loses funding. A classification changes from unusual to uncertain, from uncertain to unresolved, from unresolved to irrelevant. The language softens. The questions grow fewer. The excitement becomes caution, and the caution becomes absence. Nothing is removed, nothing is forbidden, and yet something is lost. This kind of disappearance does not feel like suppression. It feels like forgetting. It feels like the way names fade from memory when we do not speak them, or how paths vanish in a forest when no one walks them anymore. No one destroys the path. It simply becomes overgrown. And this is what makes it difficult to notice. We tend to look for villains when we think about lost knowledge. We imagine secret rooms, locked doors, hidden archives. But the fading of discoveries often does not require any of that. It happens through ordinary systems doing ordinary things. Budgets shift, priorities change, research agendas evolve. A topic becomes less fashionable, a question becomes harder to frame. A story becomes harder to fit into what is already known. So it rests. The discovery remains in a drawer, in a footnote, in a forgotten journal, in the memory of a few people who eventually retire, move on, or stop asking. And the world continues without it. This does not happen because anyone is lying. It happens because humans are gentle with their structures. We protect what feels stable. We preserve what feels coherent. When something does not quite belong, we do not always fight it. Sometimes we simply leave it where it is and walk away. The result is a quiet kind of loss, a soft erosion of possibility. Over time, the story of the past becomes smoother than the past itself. It gains shape, it gains clarity, it gains order. The rough edges are worn down, the strange details are rounded off. The parts that do not connect cleanly to the rest are treated as anomalies, then curiosities, then distractions. Eventually, they are not mentioned at all. And so the listener begins to sense something delicate and unsettling. That history is not only written by those who speak, but also by those who stop speaking. That what we remember is shaped not only by discovery, but by comfort. That the past we carry forward is the past that fits. This does not mean the forgotten discoveries were wrong. It does not mean the accepted ones are false. It simply means that memory is selective, even when it is honest. Which leads to a gentle and unavoidable question. If some discoveries fade, not because they are disproven, but because they are inconvenient, unclear, or difficult to hold, then what is shaping the story we live inside now? And more quietly still, what parts of the past are resting just beyond our attention, not erased, not hidden, but waiting for someone to notice that they were never truly gone at all? Once a discovery leaves the ground, it does not move forward on its own. It enters a long human corridor. It passes through hands, offices, committees, journals, classrooms, and museums. Each step feels reasonable. Each choice feels small. And yet together, these steps decide what the past becomes. We often imagine history as something solid, like stone tablets or carved walls, but in truth, it is more like a river shaped by banks we rarely notice. Evidence flows forward, but it is guided. It is slowed in some places and sped up in others. It is filtered, sorted, and arranged into patterns that feel natural only because we grow used to seeing them. A fragment is found, it is catalogued, a paper is written, a journal accepts it or does not, a grant supports further study or quietly moves elsewhere. A museum chooses to display it or stores it in a drawer. A textbook mentions it or leaves it out. None of these decisions feel dramatic, none of them feel final. But together, they shape what becomes visible, what becomes important, and what becomes normal. Over time, this process creates a version of the past that feels stable and complete. It feels authoritative. It feels finished. And because it feels finished, we stop asking certain questions about it. Not because the questions are forbidden, but because they feel unnecessary. This is how history becomes less about what was found and more about what fits. Institutions are not villains. They are living systems made of people who are careful, trained, and often deeply sincere. Their role is to reduce chaos into meaning, to turn fragments into stories that can be held, taught, and shared. But in doing so, they also shape the edges of what is acceptable to know. Some stories are easy to carry. They align with what we already believe about progress, about civilization, about who we are and where we came from. These stories flow smoothly through the system. They become part of the educational current. They are repeated, refined, and remembered. Other stories move more slowly. They raise questions that do not resolve neatly. They blur timelines. They complicate identities. They suggest that the past may not be as linear, as simple, or as comforting as we hoped. These stories are not rejected. They are simply harder to place. So they wait. They wait in academic journals that few people read. They wait in museum archives. They wait in unpublished drafts and unfinished research. They wait in the memories of scholars who eventually retire. They wait quietly, without asking for attention. And as they wait, the world moves on. Careers are built around certain narratives. Reputations are shaped by what is safe to pursue and what is risky to explore. Nations tell stories about their origins. Cultures tell stories about their continuity. These stories become part of identity, and identity is something humans protect gently but firmly. So when a discovery feels like it might disturb those stories, it is not attacked. It is approached carefully. It is softened with language. It is surrounded with caution. It is described in ways that reduce its sharpness, its strangeness, its ability to unsettle. Eventually, it feels less urgent, less central, less necessary. This is not manipulation, it is adaptation. History becomes not just a record of what happened, but a mirror of what we are willing to hold. It reflects our values, our fears, our need for coherence, and our desire for a world that makes sense. And so, the listener begins to sense something quietly profound. That history is not only discovered, it is negotiated. It is shaped by what we ask, what we fund, what we teach, what we repeat, and what we let fall into silence. It is shaped by what feels safe enough to carry forward and what feels too heavy, too strange, or too disruptive to keep close. Which means that the past we know is not false, but it is incomplete. It is a version that has passed through human hands and human hearts, through systems designed not just to preserve truth, but to preserve stability. And this leads to a gentle and unsettling realization that what we remember tells us as much about ourselves as it does about those who came before us. That archaeology is not only a science of ancient things, but a quiet portrait of the present moment, drawn in dust, stone, paper, and choice. And that beyond the history we recognize, there is another history resting just outside the frame, not erased, not forbidden, but waiting for someone to ask why it was never fully invited in at all. It begins like many discoveries do, without drama. A small team, a remote site, a routine excavation that had already been mapped, categorized, and largely forgotten. Nothing in the location suggested anything unusual. The ground had been walked before, the layers had been studied before. The expectations were modest, almost sleepy. And then something appeared that did not quite belong. It was not spectacular. It was not golden or monumental or obviously important. It was simply wrong in a gentle way. Its shape felt out of place. Its material did not match the layer it was found in. Its age, once estimated, seemed to lean slightly beyond where it should have been allowed to exist. At first, this was exciting. The researchers leaned closer. They spoke more quietly. They checked their measurements twice. They laughed in that restrained way people do when they are trying not to hope too much. Notes were taken carefully. Photos were captured from every angle. The artifact was lifted as though it might dissolve if handled too firmly. Early reports were written with soft enthusiasm. Words like unexpected and intriguing appeared. Nothing bold, nothing reckless. Just enough to suggest that something interesting had happened. For a moment, attention gathered. A few colleagues asked questions. A few emails were exchanged. A small circle of interest formed around the find, warm and cautious and curious. It felt like the beginning of something. Then the tone changed. Not suddenly, not obviously, just slightly. The language grew more careful. Unexpected became uncertain. Intriguing became possibly misinterpreted. Alternative explanations appeared, gentle and reasonable and incomplete. Contamination was suggested. Dating errors were mentioned. Context was questioned. None of this was wrong. It was responsible. It was correct. It was what good science does. But something else was happening alongside it. Funding that might have supported further analysis was delayed. A follow-up study was postponed. A conference presentation was quietly removed from the schedule. The artifact was stored for later examination, then stored a little longer. The circle of attention loosened. No one objected. No one protested. There was no conflict to point at, no argument to remember. The interest simply cooled, like a fire left unattended, still warm at first, then dim, then barely visible. Eventually, only the original team still felt its presence. They thought about it when writing other papers. They mentioned it in passing conversations. They wondered, privately, whether they had misunderstood something important or whether they had glimpsed something that simply did not have a place yet. Over time, even that wondering softened. The artifact remained. It was not destroyed. It was not hidden. It rested in a drawer with a label and a reference number and a short description that no longer hinted at its strangeness. It had become ordinary. This is how the first vanishing feels. Not like loss. Not like theft. Like a change in temperature. Like walking into a room where something meaningful happened once, but no one speaks of it anymore. The questions did not disappear because they were answered. They disappeared because they were not repeated. And without repetition, attention fades. Without attention, memory fades. Without memory, significance fades. Until what remains is not the mystery, but the absence of it. The listener can feel the shape of that absence. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is a hollow where curiosity once lived. A gentle emptiness where something could have grown. This is the emotional pattern that will repeat throughout the story. Not discoveries being taken away, discoveries being left behind. Left behind by changing interests, by limited time, by institutional caution, by the human preference for clarity over uncertainty, for stories that resolve over stories that open. And so the first vanishing does not feel like a warning. It feels like a sigh. It feels like something important choosing not to insist. It feels like a door that was never closed, only never opened again. And once the listener recognizes this pattern, it becomes easier to notice it elsewhere, in other reports that trailed off, in other questions that were softened, in other moments where the strange did not become forbidden, but simply became quiet, which is why the story now turns outward, because this was not the only vanishing. It was only the first one that left a shape clear enough to recognize. And now that the shape is visible, it can be followed into the world, into real places, where the same gentle fading has been happening again and again, just far enough from attention that it still feels like nothing at all. History is often described as a line. It moves forward from one moment to the next, clean and ordered, marked by dates, eras, and transitions that feel as solid as stone. We are taught to trust this line because it gives shape to the past and comfort to the present. It tells us where we came from and how long the journey has been. Yet this line is not drawn directly from the earth. It is drawn from interpretation. It is built from layers of assumption, agreement, and careful approximation. And every so often, something appears that does not quite sit on that line. It might be an object found in a layer where it should not exist. It might be a structure that seems too refined for its supposed age. It might be traces of human activity in a place that history says should have been empty. These discoveries do not arrive like storms. They arrive quietly, almost politely, and they do not demand belief. They simply ask a question that feels slightly uncomfortable. They suggest that the line we trust might be more flexible than we imagined. Archaeologists know this better than anyone. They understand that dating is never absolute. It relies on methods that are powerful but imperfect, on models that smooth over variation, on averages that calm irregularity into something manageable. Carbon decay, soil layers, comparative typology, historical, cross-reference, each tool brings us closer, but none of them deliver certainty. They deliver probability. They deliver range. They deliver best guesses refined over time. And this usually works. Most discoveries fall comfortably into place. They reinforce the structure already standing. They add detail without changing shape. But when something resists placement, when it hovers between categories or stretches beyond expectation, it is approached with care, not suspicion. Care. Because if the timeline shifts in one place, it may ripple elsewhere. A single anomaly does not stay single for long. So the first response is patience. Measurements are repeated, samples are retested, context is questioned, alternative explanations are explored. This is not avoidance. It is responsibility. It is how science protects itself from error. But alongside this care, something else happens. The language changes. What was older than expected becomes possibly misdated. What was advanced becomes not yet fully understood. What was out of place becomes contextually complex. These shifts are subtle, and they are not dishonest. They are protective. They guard the system against sudden distortion. They slow down the impact of uncertainty. And so, the discovery waits. It waits for more data. It waits for better tools. It waits for someone with enough time, enough support, and enough courage to follow the question further. Sometimes, that someone arrives. Often, they do not. This is where the listener begins to feel the fragility of certainty. Not because history is wrong, but because it is built from what we have been able to hold so far. It is a structure made from the evidence that stayed visible, that fit together well enough, that could be carried forward without strain. It is not a lie, it is a selection. And selection always leaves something behind. When timelines blur, it is not because time itself has changed, but because our picture of it has grown thin at the edges. We begin to sense that the past may be wider than our models, deeper than our measurements, and stranger than our stories. This does not mean that civilization is older than we think. It does not mean it is younger. It does not mean it rose once or many times. It simply means that our certainty about these things rests on a foundation that is less rigid than we were taught to believe. And that realization is unsettling, because if time is not as stable as we imagined, then neither is the story built upon it. The neat sequence of progress, the clean divisions between eras, the comforting sense that everything has its place and its moment, all of this begins to feel like a sketch rather than a map. A helpful sketch, a meaningful sketch, but still, a sketch. The listener is not invited to reject history here, only to soften their grip on it. To allow the possibility that the past is not a straight path but a layered landscape, full of overlaps, pauses, returns, and forgotten turns. A place where things do not always arrive in order, and where meaning does not always travel in a single direction. Once this softness enters the mind, it becomes difficult to unfeel it. Because if time itself is not fixed, if it bends and blurs and resists our neat arrangements, then the next thing that becomes uncertain is space. The places we thought we understood, the regions we thought we could separate, the boundaries we thought were ancient. And that is where the story must go next. There are moments in archaeology when the ground does not reveal an object so much as it reveals a question. And that question takes the form of a structure whose precision, scale, or alignment does not sit comfortably with what we expect its builders to have known. These moments are not dramatic. They are quiet, technical, almost gentle, appearing in measurements that feel too exact, in stones that fit too closely, in orientations that point too accurately toward events in the sky. And what unsettles the researcher is not that something is impossible, but that it is unexpected, that it does not quite match the mental picture of the past they were carrying. The listener begins to feel that this is not a clash between belief and fantasy, but a tension between expectation and evidence. Ancient people are often imagined as simpler, not because anyone thinks they were foolish, but because we imagine knowledge as something that accumulates neatly over time, rising steadily from ignorance to sophistication. When a structure appears that suggests a different pattern, a different way of knowing, or a different kind of intelligence, it does not break the story of history, but it bends it slightly, and that bending is what feels strange. A stone wall that aligns with a solstice sunrise, a monument that mirrors the motion of stars, a foundation that rests on bedrock shaped with extraordinary care, a system of channels that moves water with elegance and restraint. None of these things are impossible. They are simply more refined than expected. They suggest patience, observation, experimentation, and continuity across generations. A kind of knowledge that does not look like modern science, but does not look like accident either. The listener begins to sense that the confusion arises not because the structures are too advanced, but because they are advanced in ways we are not used to recognizing. They do not rely on written formulas or machines. They rely on time, repetition, attention, and relationship with environment. They reflect a form of intelligence that is embedded rather than abstract, practical rather than theoretical, lived rather than recorded. This is why explanations sometimes feel stretched thin, not because they are false, but because they are trying to translate one way of knowing into another. We describe a stone cut as precise, but what does precision mean in a culture that measures not in millimeters, but in shadows, in seasons, in water flow, in human movement? We say a structure is aligned, but alignment might not have meant what it means to us. It might have been a felt harmony rather than a calculated angle. The listener begins to feel that the gap is not between ancient people and modern people, but between different kinds of minds, different relationships with time, space, and nature. Modern intelligence often values speed, efficiency, and abstraction. Ancient intelligence may have valued continuity, rhythm, and attention. Neither is superior. They are different. So when a researcher stands before a structure that feels too refined for its time, what they are really encountering is not a paradox, but a mirror that reflects the limits of modern imagination. We do not lack evidence of ancient sophistication, we lack a language for it. And so we say things like, ahead of its time, as if time itself were a ladder that could be climbed in only one direction. But time is not a ladder, it is a field. Knowledge does not rise once. It emerges many times, in many forms, in many places, responding to local needs, local environments, and local meanings. The listener begins to sense that what feels advanced is simply what feels unfamiliar. It does not fit the shape of what we think intelligence should look like. It does not wear the clothing of our methods or our values. It wears the clothing of its own world. And so the question becomes softer. Not, how did they do this, but how did they think? Not what tools did they have, but what kind of attention did they bring? Not what were they missing, but what did they have that we no longer do? Perhaps they had time. Perhaps they had patience. Perhaps they had continuity across generations. Perhaps they had a deeper intimacy with land, sky, and material than we do now. Perhaps they listened longer. Perhaps they watched more carefully. Perhaps they built slowly. The listener begins to feel that this reframes the mystery not as lost technology, but as lost relationship. A relationship with the world that allowed subtle knowledge to accumulate quietly, without needing to be written down or preserved as theory. And this is why these structures feel strange, not because they do not belong, but because they remind us that civilization is not a straight line, but a weaving, a tapestry of many intelligences rising and resting, appearing and fading, each shaped by the world that held it. If intelligence is not linear, then civilization itself becomes something stranger and richer than expected, not a march toward one kind of mind, but a dance between many, and that is where the story moves next. There are moments in the archaeological record where a culture does not feel wrong, yet it does not feel placed correctly either. It appears a little too early for what it seems to understand, a little too organized for what it is supposed to be, or a little too distant from any clear line of inheritance. It does not shatter the story of the past. It simply leans against it, gently enough to make its shape feel uncertain. These civilizations do not announce themselves as contradictions. They feel more like quiet interruptions. Their cities are carefully arranged. Their tools are thoughtfully made. Their social patterns suggest intention rather than accident. Nothing about them demands rejection, and nothing about them invites easy acceptance. They exist in a soft space between explanation and mystery, so they become uneasy to hold. Not because they threaten what we know, but because they complicate what we prefer. We like histories that begin once, grow steadily, and lead directly to us. We like stories that move forward in a single direction, with clear steps and familiar milestones. These civilizations do not follow that path. They rise somewhere else, in their own time, according to their own logic, and then they fade without passing their torch clearly into another hand. They suggest that civilization may not be a single flame, but many small fires lit across a wide landscape. Some burned brightly and briefly, some smoldered for centuries. Some warmed only a small circle before going dark. None of them were mistakes. None of them were rehearsals for something better. They were simply expressions of human life unfolding under different skies, in different soils, with different needs and dreams. When we place them into our modern frameworks, they resist staying still. They do not fit neatly into our timelines. They do not align easily with our categories. They feel too complex for their supposed age, too subtle for their supposed isolation, too complete for their supposed impermanence. So they are gently moved aside. They become footnotes, regional studies, transitional phases. They are acknowledged, then allowed to drift toward the edges of attention, not because they lack meaning, but because they carry too much of it. They remind us that history is not a ladder. A ladder is simple. It has direction. It has order. It has a clear top and bottom. It makes us feel as though we know where we are going and where we came from. But history behaves less like a ladder and more like a landscape. A landscape has many peaks and valleys. It has rivers that change course, forests that grow and vanish, cities that rise and dissolve into fields. It holds memory rather than order. It allows many stories to exist at once without asking them to connect. These civilizations belong to that landscape. They are not errors in the story. They are the story, in its wider and quieter form. They show us that human development is not one continuous climb, but a series of experiments. Ways of living tried, refined, cherished, and sometimes forgotten. Ways of organizing life that worked for a time and place, then gently gave way to something else. They show us that intelligence does not appear once and spread outward. It appears wherever conditions allow it to breathe. This does not make the past chaotic. It makes it intimate. It means that some civilizations lived fully, without becoming ancestors to anyone still living. It means that some achievements were not meant to be carried forward, but simply to be lived. It means that significance does not always travel through time. Sometimes it stays where it was born and fades with the people who held it. And that is not loss. That is life. The listener begins to feel a subtle shift. The past no longer feels like a road with signposts. It feels like a field with traces of movement, footprints overlapping, campfires long extinguished, paths that mattered deeply to those who walked them, even if no one remembers them now. All of it is real. All of it is human, which is why these civilizations do not sit comfortably in our stories. They do not want to be stepping stones. They do not want to be origins. They do not want to be explanations. They want to be themselves. And once that is allowed, something else becomes clear. If entire cultures can rise and fade quietly without becoming central to memory, then the things they leave behind can do the same. Their tools, their symbols, their questions, their traces in the earth can also pass gently from attention. They do not need to be removed. They only need to be left behind. And that is where the story moves next, toward those fragile remnants, resting in soil and stone, waiting not for discovery, but for the moment someone notices that they were never truly part of the story we thought we were telling. There are places we think we know simply because we have seen them before. A hill rising gently from a plain, a quiet stretch of forest, a wide, empty shoreline where the water meets the land without ceremony. These landscapes feel ordinary, almost invisible in their familiarity. They are not dramatic. They are not sacred. They are simply there. And yet, sometimes, these are the very places where something once felt different, not different in a way that demanded attention, but different in a way that lingered. Early researchers often felt it before they could explain it. A pattern in the way stones were scattered across a field. A strange regularity in the spacing of posts, long rotted into the soil. An alignment between a rise in the land and the path of the sun that seemed too precise to be coincidence. Nothing that shouted, just enough that someone paused, looked again, and wondered. At first, these places were described with a certain openness. They were called centers, hubs, gathering grounds, or ritual spaces. They were treated as meaningful not because they were grand, but because they felt intentional. They suggested long use, repeated return, shared memory. They hinted that something had been happening there, quietly, for a very long time. The language used to describe them was careful, but curious. It left room for possibility. It allowed the place to remain slightly larger than what could be proven. Then, over time, the language changed. Not abruptly, not forcefully, just gradually. A center became a settlement. A settlement became a seasonal camp. A seasonal camp became a scatter of artifacts. A ritual alignment became a natural coincidence with cultural significance. A place that once felt layered with meaning was gently flattened into function. It is not that the earlier interpretations were declared wrong. They were softened. They were made safer. They were made easier to hold. A landscape that once felt like a meeting point of people, time, and belief became a practical location for living. A place that once felt like it held memory became a place that simply held objects. And the listener begins to feel the subtle shift, not from truth to falsehood, but from depth to simplicity. It is easier to carry a story about shelter than a story about ceremony. Easier to imagine a camp than a complex web of return, ritual, and meaning. Easier to teach a function than a feeling. So the landscape is made familiar again. The hill is just a hill. The forest is just a forest. The shore is just a shore. And in becoming familiar, it becomes smaller. This does not happen because anyone is hiding something. It happens because certainty feels kinder than openness. Because clarity feels safer than ambiguity. Because we are more comfortable with places that do one thing than with places that might have done many things. So we shrink them. We do not erase their meaning. We compress it. We do not remove their past. We simplify it. Until what remains fits neatly into our categories, our textbooks, our maps, and something subtle is lost. Not the evidence, but the atmosphere. Not the objects, but the sense that this place mattered in a way we no longer quite remember how to describe. The listener begins to notice that this happens not only to sights, but to stories, to memories, to questions. We do it gently. We do it unconsciously. We do it because the world is complex, and we need it to feel manageable. So we turn landscapes into locations. We turn places into points. We turn lived spaces into labeled spaces. And in doing so, we make them easier to hold, but harder to feel. The result is not a false history, but a thinner one. A history that works, but does not always breathe. A history that explains, but does not always listen. And the listener begins to sense that perhaps the past is not disappearing from these places. It is being translated into a language that cannot carry all of it at once. Which means that when a place feels empty, it may not be because nothing happened there. It may be because what happened there no longer fits the way we have learned to speak. And this is where the story quietly widens. Because if a single hill or shoreline can be redefined this way, then entire regions can be. Entire cultures can be. Entire histories can be gently reshaped until they feel simpler, smaller, and more familiar than they truly were. Not because the truth is being taken away, but because it is being made easier to carry. And once that becomes visible, the listener is ready to notice something even more delicate, that if places can be redefined, then the lines between them can be too. That borders, boundaries, and maps may not be recording the past so much as organizing it. And that is where the story moves next, into the quiet spaces between places, where history begins to blur not because it is unclear, but because it never belonged to only one place at all. When we look at the ancient world, we often imagine it through the shape of our own. We see countries where there were once only regions, borders where there were once only paths, names where there were once only directions. We overlay the present onto the past so gently that it feels natural, and then we forget that we did it. Ancient people did not live inside the outlines we draw today. They moved according to rivers, seasons, trade winds, migrations, kinship, and curiosity. They crossed hills because hills were there, followed water because water sustained them, and gathered where land, food, and meaning met. Their world was not divided by lines, but by rhythms. Yet, archaeology often moves within the borders we recognize now. Research is funded by modern states. Excavations are permitted by present governments. Museums are national. Archives are regional. Journals are organized by language and institution. So the story of the past is quietly sorted into modern containers, even when the past itself never knew those containers existed. A site is studied on one side of a border. A related site lies just beyond it. Different teams work on each. Different methods are used. Different interpretations form. Over time, what may once have been part of a single cultural network becomes described as two separate stories. Not because anyone is dividing it, but because the system naturally does. The listener begins to sense the invisible lines. They run across deserts, through forests, over rivers that once connected rather than separated. They turn trade routes into national histories. They turn shared knowledge into parallel inventions. They turn migrations into origins. And slowly, the past becomes still. A world that was once fluid becomes framed. A story that was once woven becomes segmented. A network becomes a map. This does not erase connection. It makes it harder to see. When we speak of ancient cultures, we speak as though they belong to places, but more often, they belong to movement. They belong to exchange, to contact, to the long conversation between distant communities that traded goods, stories, tools, and ideas across wide spaces. Knowledge did not stay where it was born. It traveled with people. It moved with caravans, with boats, with families, with exiles, with wanderers. It crossed mountains and seas, not because it had permission, but because it had momentum. And so cultures were not islands, they were currents. But when we draw borders across them, we turn currents into pools. We make them seem self-contained, self-generated, self-limited. We speak of isolated development when there may have been shared influence. We speak of independent invention when there may have been quiet transmission. We speak of separate identities when there may have been overlapping ones, not because this is false, but because it is simpler. It is easier to tell the story of a nation than the story of a network, easier to trace a lineage than a web, easier to follow a line than to hold a field. So we let borders organize memory, and memory becomes structured. The listener begins to feel that this structuring is not wrong, but partial. It captures the shape of history, but not its movement. It shows where things were, but not how they flowed. It shows us the bones, but not the breath. Which is why certain questions feel harder to ask. How did ideas travel so far? How did techniques appear in distant places? How did styles echo across oceans? How did people who never met share ways of seeing the world? These questions do not fit easily into bordered stories, so they wait. They remain in the spaces between chapters, between disciplines, between regions, and the listener begins to imagine the ancient world differently. Not as a patchwork of territories, but as a living field of motion. A world where people moved more than they stayed, where identity was flexible, where belonging shifted with seasons, marriages, trades, and journeys, where culture was not owned, but shared. This does not make the past less grounded. It makes it more human. It allows history to feel alive rather than archived. And once that shift is felt, something else becomes visible. That the maps we use do not simply show us where things were, they show us how we choose to see. They reveal our need for order, for boundaries, for clarity. They reveal how we prefer to organize complexity into shapes we can hold. And that is where the story moves next. Because if borders shape history, then maps shape borders, and maps, too, may be telling a quieter story than we think. Maps feel like records. They feel solid, finished, trustworthy. We open them and expect to see the world as it is, or as it was. We assume that what appears on them is stable, and that what does not appear never mattered. But maps are not only records of place, they are records of attention. They show not just where things are, but what someone decided was worth noticing. And what is noticed can change. Not suddenly, not loudly, not with declarations or debates, but quietly, through updates, revisions, new additions that replace old ones without ceremony. A name is shortened. A symbol is simplified. A once bold marker becomes a faint dot. A region once shaded with meaning becomes a neutral background. Nothing is removed. It is just reduced. A city that was once marked as a center becomes a settlement. A settlement becomes a site. A site becomes a coordinate. Over time, the language thins, and with it, the sense of importance. What once felt like a story becomes a location. What once felt like a presence becomes a point. The listener begins to feel that maps do not erase the past. They rebalance it. They shift weight from one place to another, from one story to another, until the whole field feels different without ever appearing to change. A cultural region that once had a name becomes a historical phase. A historical phase becomes a footnote. A footnote becomes a reference number few people follow. The shape remains, but the meaning fades. The form survives, but the memory does not. This is not destruction. It is editing. And editing always carries intention, even when it feels neutral. Maps do not shout about what they remove. They whisper about what they keep. They tell us what is central by placing it in the center. They tell us what is important by enlarging it. They tell us what is marginal by shrinking it. They guide the eye, and the eye guides the mind. So when a place becomes smaller on the map, it becomes smaller in thought. When a region loses its label, it loses its voice. When a term disappears, the idea it named becomes harder to hold. And the listener begins to sense something quietly powerful, that maps are not only tools of navigation, they are tools of memory. They decide what feels close and what feels distant, what feels connected and what feels isolated, what feels like a center and what feels like an edge. They decide what we expect to find before we ever look. So when a map changes, history changes with it, not because the past itself has moved, but because our relationship to it has. A map once told a story of networks. A new map tells a story of territories. A map once showed flows of movement. A new one shows blocks of ownership. A map once suggested shared space. A new one suggests division. None of these are lies, but none of them are complete. They are perspectives, and perspectives shape memory. This is why the past can feel as though it has grown quieter without ever being taken away. The noise has not been removed. The volume has been turned down. The bold lines become thin. The colors become pale. The labels become numbers. And eventually, what remains feels technical rather than human. The listener begins to feel a soft sadness in this realization, not because anything was stolen, but because something was softened until it no longer stirred the same feeling. The past was not erased. It was reorganized. And in being reorganized, it was made easier to manage and harder to feel. The story of humanity became cleaner, but also narrower. It became easier to teach, but harder to question. It became more orderly, but less alive. And this is how the world we inherit is shaped, not by dramatic acts of forgetting, but by gentle acts of rearranging, not by removing what is uncomfortable, but by resizing it until it no longer demands attention, not by hiding meaning, but by redistributing it. So the listener begins to understand that every map is also a choice, every label a suggestion, every omission a quiet decision. And once that understanding settles, something else becomes visible. That if places can be resized in memory, then so can the things found within them. If regions can fade, then artifacts can too. If stories can shrink, then objects can change meaning. And that is where the story moves next, from the spaces on the map to the things in the ground, where meaning does not disappear, but slowly transforms into something easier, smaller, and quieter than it once was. Objects feel stable in a way that stories do not. A stone tool remains a stone tool. A carved figure remains carved. A shard of pottery remains a shard. We trust objects because they seem to resist interpretation. They sit in cases, in drawers, in photographs, unchanged by time. And yet, the meaning we place around them is always moving. It shifts quietly, carried by language, by labels, by the small words we choose when we describe what something is. An artifact does not lose its shape when it loses its story. It loses something softer. It loses its weight. A vessel that was once called ceremonial becomes decorative. A carving that was once described as symbolic becomes uncertain. A structure that was once considered central becomes contextually unclear. The object remains, the description changes, and through that change, the object becomes smaller in the mind. This is not because new evidence has disproven its meaning. Often, nothing new has been found at all. The change happens because the meaning no longer sits comfortably inside the larger story being told. It feels too complex, too suggestive, too open. So it is softened. Language becomes a kind of filter. Words that once carried depth are replaced with words that carry safety. Sacred becomes special. Special becomes unusual. Unusual becomes unclear. Unclear becomes undecided. Undecided becomes unimportant. Nothing is removed. Everything is renamed. And the listener begins to feel how powerful that is. We are taught to look for power in force, in removal, in denial. But here, power is gentle. It is quiet. It lives in dictionaries, in captions, in footnotes, in the small choices that decide whether something is called meaningful or merely interesting. Once something is called decorative, it no longer needs to be understood. Once something is called uncertain, it no longer needs to be held. Once something is called contextually unclear, it no longer needs to be explained. It can rest, and in resting, it fades, not from existence, but from significance. The listener begins to notice that this happens everywhere, in museums where labels change over time, in textbooks where terms are updated, in academic writing where confidence gives way to caution, and caution gives way to silence. None of this feels dishonest. It feels responsible. It feels careful. It feels like a desire not to overreach. But care has a shape, and that shape can become a boundary. The boundary does not keep things out. It keeps them small. An artifact that once invited questions now closes them. A symbol that once opened imagination now feels flat. A fragment that once hinted at a worldview now feels like a curiosity without context. The listener begins to sense that meaning is not lost when an object is renamed. It is relocated. It moves from the object into the margins. It moves from the main story into the background. It moves from shared attention into private wondering, and because it is no longer shared, it becomes easier to forget. This is not erasure. It is diffusion. Meaning spreads so thin that it becomes invisible. And invisible things do not demand care. They do not demand memory. They do not demand space. So they rest quietly in drawers and cases and databases, present but no longer present in the way that matters. The listener feels a soft melancholy here, not grief, but something gentler. The sense that something has not been taken away, but slowly loosened until it no longer holds. And perhaps this is the most subtle kind of loss. Not the loss of objects, but the loss of relationship with them. Because objects are not just things, they are traces of intention. They are evidence of thought, of belief, of longing, of structure. They are the physical echoes of invisible worlds. And when we rename them into safety, we make those worlds harder to reach. Not because we are hiding them, but because we are protecting ourselves from their depth. Depth requires patience. It requires uncertainty. It requires a willingness to sit with what cannot be fully known. Renaming allows us to move on. It allows us to feel finished, and finished feels comforting. But the listener now senses that what feels finished may only be quiet, that what feels resolved may only be resting, that what feels small may only be unnamed. Which is why the story continues, because if objects can be softened by language, then stories can be softened too. And if artifacts can lose weight without being removed, then histories can lose weight without being denied, and that is where the pattern leads next, away from the things themselves and into the narratives built around them, where meaning does not vanish, but slowly changes shape until it no longer feels like what it once was at all. Stories do not disappear all at once. They thin, they soften, they lose their edges. They move from the center of conversation to its margins, from lectures to footnotes, from footnotes to memory, and from memory into silence. They do not vanish because they are forbidden. They vanish because they become inconvenient to carry. A story becomes too complex for a classroom, too uncertain for a textbook, too long for a lecture, too strange for a test. It does not fit into the space allotted for it, so it is gently set aside. Something simpler replaces it, something cleaner, something that moves more easily from page to page, from teacher to student, from generation to generation, and this feels reasonable. Education needs structure. It needs clarity. It needs boundaries. It needs beginnings and endings. It needs stories that can be taught in an hour, remembered in a year, and summarized in a sentence. Stories that resist these shapes become heavy. They slow things down. They demand attention that the system is not built to give. So they are released, not with intention, but with relief. A complex interpretation becomes a brief mention. A brief mention becomes a suggested reading. A suggested reading becomes optional. Optional becomes unnecessary. Unnecessary becomes forgotten, and the listener begins to feel how quiet this is. No argument, no protest, no loss that can be pointed to, just a soft absence. The sadness here is not sharp. It is gentle. It is the sadness of realizing that something meaningful has slipped out of view without anyone deciding that it should. The stories that fade are not wrong stories. They are unfinished stories. They are stories that ask questions without offering closure, that open doors without telling you what is on the other side, that complicate rather than confirm. They invite wondering instead of certainty, and wonder is hard to schedule. So these stories become tiring. They become inconvenient. They become the kind of thing that feels better left for later, and later becomes never. The listener begins to notice that this happens not only in schools, but everywhere. In media that prefers clear narratives, in museums that need simple labels, in documentaries that need pacing, in conversations that need conclusions. We do not remove difficult stories, we outgrow them, or at least we tell ourselves that we do. We tell ourselves that we have refined the narrative, improved the explanation, cleaned up the past. But what we often mean is that we have made it easier to hold, and easier is not the same as truer. This is how forgetting can feel like progress. The story becomes simpler, the timeline becomes clearer, the questions become fewer, the world becomes more understandable, and understanding feels good. It feels safe. It feels like movement. So we celebrate it. We call it clarity. We call it advancement. We call it knowledge. And we do not notice what we have left behind. The listener begins to sense that every simplification carries a cost, not a visible one, but an invisible one. A cost paid in lost nuance, lost uncertainty, lost curiosity, lost humility. When a story is no longer told, it does not stop existing. It stops shaping us, and that is what truly fades. The influence, the challenge, the invitation to think differently. Over time, the questions that once disturbed us become questions we no longer know how to ask. The ideas that once complicated our view of the world become ideas we no longer remember existed, and the world feels calmer, quieter, more stable, but also smaller, less open, less strange, less alive. The listener feels the quiet sadness of this not as grief, but as a subtle narrowing, a sense that something has closed without anyone closing it, that something has ended without anyone deciding it should. And perhaps this is why the loss is so easy to accept. It does not feel like loss. It feels like tidiness. It feels like maturity. It feels like order. And yet, beneath that order, something is missing. Not facts, not data, not evidence, but the space where curiosity used to live, the space where the unknown was allowed to be present, the space where the past could be felt rather than mastered. Which is why the story does not stop here, because if stories can fade, then the people who carried them can fade too. The ones who asked the difficult questions, the ones who stayed with uncertainty, the ones who refused to let the story become too neat. And that is where the story moves next. From the stories themselves to the voices that once kept them alive. And what happens when those voices grow quiet as well? Some people do not leave a field because they fail. They leave because the field slowly moves away from them. Their work does not fit the current shape of attention. Their questions do not align with the direction of funding. Their interests do not produce the kind of clarity the system prefers. And so they remain present, but no longer visible. They publish less, not because they have nothing to say, but because fewer places want to hear it. Their papers are read by fewer people. Their names appear less often in references. Their work becomes something that exists rather than something that circulates. This is how a voice fades, not through rejection, but through quiet narrowing. At first, nothing feels wrong. The researcher continues working. They refine their ideas. They gather more data. They speak carefully. But the invitations slow. The conferences do not call. The journals respond politely but slowly. The excitement that once met their work softens into caution, then into distance, and distance becomes normal. The listener begins to feel the emotional shape of this, the slow realization that curiosity has a cost, that asking questions outside the accepted frame does not lead to conflict, but to isolation, that being different is not punished, but overlooked. This is harder to endure than opposition. Opposition acknowledges presence. Silence dissolves it. So the researcher adapts. They soften their language. They narrow their focus. They choose safer questions. Or they choose to stop asking altogether, not because they have been defeated, but because they are tired. They grow older. They teach. They supervise. They watch younger scholars move into the center, while their own work drifts toward the edges. They become mentors rather than voices. They become memory rather than movement. And eventually, even that fades. Their books go out of print. Their articles are no longer cited. Their names become unfamiliar even within the field they once helped shape, not because they were wrong, but because they did not fit. The listener begins to feel a quiet sadness here, not the sadness of loss, but the sadness of absence, the sense that something valuable has slipped into the background without being recognized as valuable. These researchers are not rebels. They are not provocateurs. They are not trying to disrupt. They are trying to understand. But understanding does not always travel well. It does not always condense into clear conclusions. It does not always serve narratives that need to be tidy. So it remains where it is, heavy and complex and full of unresolved questions. And unresolved questions are hard to carry, so they are left with the people who ask them until even those people are gone. The listener begins to sense that this is not an accident. It is a pattern, not a cruel one, a human one. We remember what moves us forward. We forget what slows us down. We celebrate answers. We tire of questions. And so those who live with questions rather than conclusions become less visible over time. Not because they are dangerous, but because they are demanding. They ask us to pause, to doubt, to hold complexity, to admit that we do not know, and that is not always what a system designed for clarity and progress wants to support. So the system drifts away, and the researchers drift with it, not expelled, not silenced, simply left behind. The listener begins to feel empathy not only for these individuals, but for the human shape of this forgetting. We do not mean to do it. We do not plan it. It happens because we move toward what feels light and away from what feels heavy. But weight is not the same as worth. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes the heaviest questions are the ones that matter most. And when the people who carry those questions fade from memory, the questions fade with them, which means that the shape of knowledge is not only determined by what is discovered, it is determined by who remains present to remember it. This is why the story does not stop with the fading of objects or the fading of stories. It continues into the fading of people, because people are the bridges between evidence and meaning. They are the carriers of context. They are the ones who keep questions alive, and when they grow quiet, the world does not become emptier. It becomes simpler, and simpler is easier to hold. But it is not always closer to truth. And that is why the fading of these researchers is not just a personal loss. It is a narrowing of the story itself, a gentle closing of the field of what can be known, and that is where the pattern leads next, away from individuals and into the larger systems that shape what kinds of people, questions, and stories are allowed to remain visible at all. There is a quiet moment in the life of every mystery when it becomes something else. It does not vanish. It does not collapse. It is simply translated into a different language, one that feels safer, more precise, more manageable. What was once strange becomes sensible. What was once symbolic becomes functional. What once invited wonder becomes something that can be measured, named, and placed. This translation feels like progress. We learn how something works, and in learning how it works, we feel that we have moved closer to it, that we have brought it into the light, that we have made it ours, and often we have. But something subtle happens in that movement. The thing becomes smaller. A structure that once felt sacred becomes structural. A gathering that once felt ritual becomes routine. A pattern that once felt meaningful becomes accidental. Nothing is disproven. Nothing is denied. It is simply reframed, and in being reframed, it loses its depth. The listener begins to sense that explanation does not always add. Sometimes it replaces. We replace one kind of knowing with another. We replace feeling with function. We replace presence with process. We replace meaning with mechanism. This does not make us wrong. It makes us comfortable. We are more at ease with things we can describe than with things we can only feel. We trust what we can diagram more than what we can sense. We prefer what can be repeated over what can only be experienced. So we explain. We build models. We draw diagrams. We write equations. We tell ourselves that now we understand, and often we do, but understanding is not the same as relationship. The listener begins to feel that something is lost in the moment, a mystery is solved, not the answer, but the invitation. When something is mysterious, it calls us into it. It asks us to sit with it, to return to it, to let it change us. It opens space inside us for uncertainty, humility, and imagination. When something becomes a mechanism, it closes that space. It tells us the story is finished. It tells us we can move on. It tells us there is nothing more to feel here. So we do, we move on, and the world becomes quieter, not because there is less in it, but because we are listening differently. We are listening for explanations instead of for meaning. We are listening for causes instead of for connections. We are listening for functions instead of for stories. And in doing so, we flatten the world just enough to make it easier to carry. This flattening is not malicious. It is human. We cannot live inside wonder all the time. It is too wide. It is too open. It is too demanding. We need closure. We need clarity. We need things to settle. So we let mystery become mechanism. We let the strange become normal. We let the symbolic become structural. And we feel relief. But relief is not the same as enrichment. It is the easing of tension, not the deepening of experience. The listener begins to sense that a world without mystery is not a world without knowledge. It is a world without depth. It is a world that explains itself instead of experiencing itself. It is a world that moves forward instead of inward. And perhaps this is why so many explanations feel empty even when they are correct. They tell us how something happens, but not why it matters. They tell us what something is, but not what it means. They give us answers, but not resonance. So we learn more and feel less. We know more and sense less. We master the world and lose our relationship with it, and none of this is wrong. It is simply a choice we have made without noticing that it was a choice. A choice to value clarity over mystery, function over feeling, mechanism over meaning. The listener begins to feel the quiet cost of this choice, not as a tragedy, but as a narrowing of attention, a narrowing of imagination, a narrowing of the space where wonder once lived. And this narrowing does not stop with objects or discoveries. It moves inward. Because when we explain the world into mechanisms, we begin to explain ourselves the same way. We become systems. We become processes. We become functions. And in becoming those things, we lose something softer, something that cannot be measured, something that cannot be explained, something that can only be felt. Which is why the story now turns gently away from explanation itself and toward the inner space that explanation slowly displaces. Because if mystery becomes mechanism, then imagination becomes the next thing to disappear. And that disappearance is quieter than all the others, because it happens inside us, and we rarely notice when it begins. There is a quiet difference between being wrong and not knowing. And for many people and institutions, not knowing is the harder place to stand. Being wrong can be corrected. It can be revised. It can be replaced with something better. But not knowing leaves no structure to lean on. It offers no ground. It asks us to wait in uncertainty without the comfort of resolution. And waiting is something we are not taught to do well, so we choose something instead. We choose an answer, even when it is imperfect, even when it is incomplete, even when it does not fully fit. An explanation, any explanation, feels better than an open question. It gives us something to hold. It gives us a shape where there was none. It gives us the sense that we are moving forward rather than standing still, and standing still feels like failure. The listener begins to sense how deeply emotional this is. We like to imagine knowledge as rational, clean, and neutral, but beneath it lives a human need for stability. We want the world to make sense not only intellectually, but emotionally. We want to feel oriented. We want to feel that we know where we are and what we are doing. Certainty gives us that feeling. It is a resting place. It is a pause from wondering. It is a shelter from the discomfort of ambiguity. So when faced with something we cannot fully explain, we do not always resist it. We settle it. We place a frame around it. We give it a name. We call it understood, and we move on. The explanation does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be sufficient. Sufficient to allow the system to continue. Sufficient to allow teaching to proceed. Sufficient to allow research to move forward into new questions, rather than remain with old ones. So we do not fear error as much as we fear openness. Error is temporary. Uncertainty is endless. The listener begins to feel the quiet trade that is being made. We trade depth for comfort. We trade openness for order. We trade wonder for rest. And we do this not because we are lazy, but because we are tired. The human mind cannot live forever in a state of unresolved questioning. It seeks closure the way the body seeks sleep. So we build stories that close. We build models that settle. We build explanations that end the conversation. And we call that knowledge. This is not a flaw. It is a survival strategy. But like all strategies, it has consequences. One of those consequences is that some questions never get the space they need. They are answered too soon. They are resolved too quickly. They are put to bed before they have finished speaking. And in being put to bed, they are also put away. The listener begins to notice how often this happens. How often a question is not followed, but replaced. How often an uncertainty is not explored, but covered. How often a mystery is not entered, but closed. Not because anyone is hiding anything, but because everyone is trying to feel safe. And safety feels like certainty. Certainty feels like knowing. Knowing feels like control. And control feels like peace. But peace achieved this way is fragile. It depends on not looking too closely. It depends on not asking too deeply. It depends on not disturbing the answers we have already chosen. So over time, we become careful with curiosity. We learn which questions are welcome and which are exhausting. We learn which uncertainties are productive and which are uncomfortable. We learn when to stop. And stopping becomes a form of wisdom. We call it maturity. We call it discipline. We call it restraint. But beneath it is a quiet fear. The fear of standing in not knowing. The fear of admitting that the world is larger than our explanations. The fear of letting a question remain open. So we close it. We choose a story. We choose a model. We choose a mechanism. And we rest. The listener begins to feel both the kindness and the cost of this. The kindness is that it allows us to function. The cost is that it narrows what we allow ourselves to see. It narrows what we dare to imagine. It narrows what we are willing to remember. Which is why the story does not end here. Because if fear shapes explanation, then something else shapes what we keep open. Something quieter, something rarer, something that asks us not to close the question too quickly, something that asks us to stay with what we do not know. And that something is courage, and that is where the story moves next. Some questions do not threaten laws, institutions, or authority. They threaten something quieter. They threaten the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, where we came from, and why the world looks the way it does. They threaten the emotional structures that make life feel coherent. And because of that, they can feel dangerous, even when they are gentle. These questions do not arrive loudly. They do not demand attention. They appear as small doubts, quiet wonders, subtle misalignments between what we believe and what we observe. They do not shout that something is wrong. They whisper that something might be incomplete. And incompleteness is unsettling. We build our sense of self around continuity. We want our personal stories, our cultural stories, and our historical stories to align. We want to feel that we belong to something stable, something understandable, something that has a clear shape and direction. When a question threatens that shape, It does not feel like a question. It feels like a disturbance. So we hesitate. We feel a small resistance, not because the question is harmful, but because it is disorienting. The listener begins to feel how emotional this is, how curiosity can feel like standing at the edge of a familiar room and realizing there may be another room beyond it that we do not know how to enter. The fear is not of what is in that room. The fear is of what it might do to the room we are already standing in. So we step back. We look away. We let the question soften. We tell ourselves that it is interesting, but not important, that it is possible, but not necessary, that it is curious, but not relevant. And in doing so, we protect something. We protect our sense of order. We protect our sense of belonging. We protect our sense of meaning. The listener begins to sense that some discoveries disappear, not because they are false, but because they are intimate. They reach too close. They ask us to reconsider not just facts, but identities. They ask us to loosen our grip on stories that have become part of who we are. And loosening that grip feels like loss. So we avoid it. We tell ourselves we are being practical. We tell ourselves we are being careful. We tell ourselves we are being responsible. But beneath those words is a quieter truth. We are being protective. Protective of the self we recognize. Protective of the world we know how to navigate. Protective of the meanings that give our lives a sense of shape. So curiosity becomes something to manage rather than follow. Something to guide rather than surrender to. Something to hold at a distance rather than allow to transform us. And transformation is what curiosity always offers. Not change in information, but change in perspective. Not change in data, but change in self. So when curiosity becomes dangerous, it is not because it threatens power. It is because it threatens comfort. It is because it threatens familiarity. It is because it threatens the quiet agreements we have made with ourselves about how the world works and who we are within it. The listener begins to feel a soft compassion for this. Not judgment, not accusation, just understanding. We are not avoiding truth. We are avoiding the feeling of being changed by it. And change is effort. Change is uncertainty. Change is the loss of old language before new language arrives. So we pause. We wait. We let the discovery rest, not because it is wrong, but because we are not ready. This is how curiosity becomes something that feels risky, not because it leads to danger, but because it leads to transformation. And transformation is always a kind of loss, even when it is also a kind of growth. The listener begins to sense that remembering, in this light, is not just an act of recall. It is an act of willingness, a willingness to let ourselves be reshaped by what we learn, a willingness to let the past alter the present, a willingness to become someone slightly different than we were before. And that is not a small thing. So remembering becomes quiet, it becomes gentle. It becomes something we do carefully, not loudly, not forcefully, but with attention, with patience, with courage. And that is why the story now turns toward remembering itself, not as a mental act, but as an emotional one, because if curiosity is risky, then remembering is brave, and that is where the story goes next. Curiosity rarely begins as rebellion. It usually begins as interest, as a quiet pull towards something that does not quite fit, as a sense that there is more to understand than what has already been explained. Most scholars do not start by wanting to disrupt anything. They start by wanting to learn. They notice a pattern that feels incomplete, a gap that feels meaningful, a question that does not settle when it should, and they follow it gently, without knowing yet that following it will cost them something. The cost does not arrive as a warning or a barrier. It arrives as atmosphere, a shift in tone, a slight cooling of response, a delay that is not explained, a review that is careful rather than enthusiastic, a grant that almost makes it through, and then quietly does not. No one says no. No one says stop. The system simply begins to lean away. At first, this feels small and easy to ignore, easy to explain away as timing, framing, or readiness. Perhaps the field is not ready yet. Perhaps the language was unclear, so the scholar adjusts. They soften their claims, narrow their language, emphasize the safer parts of their work, and minimize the parts that feel uncertain or disruptive. They learn how to speak in ways that invite less resistance. And this feels like maturity, like professionalism, like learning the rules of a complex space. But something has shifted beneath that surface adaptation. The question is still there, but it is now wrapped in caution, filtered through what can be published, what can be funded, what can be defended. The scholar is no longer only asking what is true, they are also asking what is acceptable, and those two things slowly move apart. The listener begins to feel the emotional weight of this, not as tragedy, but as quiet tension. A tension between curiosity and survival, between exploration and stability, between the desire to know and the need to belong. The system itself is not cruel, it is careful. It is built to protect what already works, to avoid risk, to minimize error, and to ensure continuity. And continuity depends on predictability. Predictability depends on agreement, and agreement depends on staying close to what is already known. So the system rewards what fits, supports what aligns, and slows what diverges. Not to punish it, but to manage it. Management feels reasonable, responsible, and safe, and so over time the scholar learns to manage themselves. They learn when to speak and when to remain quiet, which ideas are welcome and which feel tiring to others, how to shape a question so that it does not disturb too much. They learn how to place curiosity inside a form that will be received, and in doing so they remain inside the system. They survive, they belong. But at the same time something else happens. The question becomes smaller, not because it matters less, but because it has been translated into something easier to hold. Its edges are smoothed, its implications softened, its depth compressed. The scholar may not notice this at first, because it feels like compromise, and compromise feels necessary, even reasonable, until one day it becomes visible that the question they are now asking is no longer the question they once cared about, but a version of it that can exist safely here. The listener begins to feel empathy rather than blame in this, because this is not a personal failure but a human pattern. We all shape ourselves to fit the places we want to stay. We all negotiate between what draws us and what we can afford to pursue. We all make small choices in order to belong, and those choices accumulate into habits, identities, and careers. Over time, curiosity does not vanish, but it relocates, moving inward, becoming private rather than shared, thought rather than spoken, felt rather than followed. The cost is not that questions are forbidden, but that they become lonely. Not that curiosity is destroyed, but that it is isolated. Not that knowledge is censored, but that it is filtered until only certain shapes remain visible. And this filtering is not born of malice, but of comfort. Comfort with what is known, with what is agreed upon, with what does not disturb the structures we rely on. Perhaps that is the greatest risk to knowledge, not that it will be stopped, but that it will be made comfortable. And once it is comfortable, it no longer stretches, no longer surprises, no longer moves. It rests. And when knowledge rests too long, silence begins to feel safer than speech. Which is why, if asking costs too much, silence becomes a form of self-protection, and that is where the story moves next. Some people do not stop asking because they stop caring. They stop because caring begins to cost more than they can afford to give. Curiosity takes energy, attention, emotional openness, and a willingness to live with uncertainty, and over time that weight accumulates. What begins as interest slowly becomes effort. What begins as exploration slowly becomes negotiation. What begins as excitement slowly becomes strain, not because the work itself is wrong, but because carrying it inside systems that resist it requires a constant emotional posture that is difficult to sustain. At first, this posture feels temporary. The researcher tells themselves they are only resting, only stepping back for a while, only giving themselves space to recover before returning. They imagine the questions waiting patiently, like books left open on a desk, ready to be picked up again. But time does not pause the way we expect it to. The world moves forward, the field shifts, new conversations begin, and the place where the question once lived quietly closes. The listener begins to feel the soft sadness of this, not as loss, but as drift. The questions are not abandoned, they are set down. The researcher does not renounce them, they release them. This release does not feel dramatic, it feels practical. It feels like choosing peace over tension, quiet over friction, stability over strain. It feels like choosing rest. And rest is necessary. Burnout is not only exhaustion of the body, it is exhaustion of the self. It is what happens when effort outpaces meaning, when the energy we give does not return to us in the form of recognition, progress, or connection. Over time, the researcher feels that they are pouring themselves into something that does not quite receive them. The work continues, but the sense of being met by it fades. And when that happens, stepping away begins to feel kinder than continuing. Kinder to the self. Kinder to the family. Kinder to the life that exists beyond the work. So the researcher chooses quiet, not as surrender, but as care. Not as failure, but as survival. They redirect their energy toward teaching, mentoring, administration, or entirely different pursuits. They become something else. They become someone else. Not because they wanted to leave the questions behind, but because the questions no longer had a place to live without hurting them. The listener begins to feel empathy here, not judgment. This is not the story of people who gave up. It is the story of people who chose to live. People who chose wholeness over persistence. People who chose rest over resistance. But rest has a shadow. When individuals step away, their questions step away with them. The lines of inquiry grow thinner. The conversations grow quieter. The field slowly reshapes itself around what remains. And what remains is what is easiest to carry. What remains is what fits. What remains is what does not exhaust. So the world becomes calmer, but also narrower. The listener begins to feel that the cost of this narrowing is not immediately visible. It does not appear as loss. It appears as order, as clarity, as focus, as efficiency. The field becomes easier to manage. The narratives become cleaner. The boundaries become firmer. The discomfort recedes. And with it, so does depth. The listener feels the gentle grief of this. Not grief for a specific person or idea, but grief for a kind of presence that is now less common. The presence of those willing to stay with complexity, to live with unfinished questions, to tolerate not knowing. These people do not leave a trace when they go. They do not leave a gap. They leave a quiet that feels like peace. But peace is not the same as fullness. It is stillness, not richness. It is absence of friction, not presence of meaning. So, when the listener hears that stepping away feels kinder than being right, they begin to understand that kindness and truth are not always aligned, and that sometimes choosing oneself means choosing silence, and that silence, when chosen often enough, reshapes the world just as surely as speech does. And that is why the story moves next from individuals to institutions, because when many people choose quiet over conflict, the institutions they leave behind become quieter too, not because they are empty, but because they have been shaped by what remains. Silence does not usually feel like emptiness. More often it feels like relief, like the end of a strain that has been held for too long. When questions stop pressing forward, when debates slow and uncertainties no longer demand attention, both people and systems experience a sense of settling. The world feels calmer, more ordered, more stable, and this stability is deeply attractive, especially after periods of complexity, conflict, or cognitive effort. Unanswered questions do not disappear, but they recede into the background, no longer shaping conversations, no longer pulling at thought, no longer asking for resolution, and in their absence, a gentle quiet appears that feels like peace. This peace does not feel dishonest or manipulative. It feels kind, even merciful, like being allowed to rest after carrying something heavy. There is no longer the need to argue, to justify, to defend, or to re-explain. The narrative becomes smooth enough to live inside without discomfort, without tension, without disruption, and because it no longer resists us, it no longer asks much of us either. But something subtle changes here, not in the content of the story, but in its vitality. The story stops moving. It stops inviting participation. It stops unfolding, and instead becomes something finished, something settled, something to be accepted rather than engaged. The listener begins to sense that silence functions like a soft covering over what was once unresolved. It does not erase difficulty, but it mutes it. It does not destroy complexity, but it lowers its volume until it is no longer heard. The unknown becomes distant. The uncertain becomes quiet. The unresolved becomes unimportant. Not because it has lost its value, but because it has lost its presence. Silence becomes full rather than empty, full of the questions we chose not to follow, the ideas we chose not to hold, the tensions we chose not to carry. And because those things are no longer present, we feel lighter, calmer, safer. There is a quiet trade happening here that does not feel like a loss because it is gentle rather than violent. Peace is being purchased with presence, calm with complexity, order with openness, and the trade feels humane because it mirrors the small choices people make every day when they turn away from what hurts, unsettles, or exhausts them. We do not deny those things. We simply look elsewhere, and looking elsewhere feels like relief. But relief is not the same as resolution. It eases pressure without answering what created the pressure. And so the questions remain without voices, without homes, without influence, still existing but no longer shaping anything. Over time, the world begins to feel consistent, predictable, stable. And this stability is not false, but it is fragile. Because it depends on not reopening what has been closed and not revisiting what has been set aside. Silence becomes something to protect, not because it hides something, but because it feels good. It feels like safety, and once silence is valued in this way, it begins to guide behavior. Certain questions feel welcome, others feel tiring. Certain topics feel natural, others feel heavy. Certain conversations flow, others resist, and gradually, what is avoided begins to shape the world just as much as what is embraced. The listener begins to sense that silence is not neutral, it is active. It shapes memory by shaping what is allowed to fade. It shapes truth by shaping what is carried forward. It shapes the future by shaping what is remembered. And it does all of this, not through force, but through comfort. That is why silence feels peaceful, because it removes friction, but friction is not always destructive. Sometimes friction is the sign that something important is still alive, that a story is still unfolding, that we are still in relationship with what we do not yet understand. When silence replaces that tension, the world becomes smoother, easier to inhabit, but also flatter, easier to live in, but harder to grow in. And this is why the story now turns toward what happens when silence becomes normal, when it becomes the ground rather than the pause, when it becomes the expected state. Because once silence becomes normal, it begins to shape power. And that is where politics quietly enters the story. History is rarely experienced as a collection of facts. It is experienced as a story people live inside, a story that tells them who they are, where they came from, and how they belong to the world around them. Long before history becomes academic, it becomes emotional, becoming the ground beneath identity by offering continuity, where life feels uncertain, and meaning where existence feels fragile. A shared past creates a shared self, and a shared self creates the feeling of belonging that people seek in families, cultures, and nations alike, which is why stories of origin carry such weight, not simply because they explain beginnings, but because they justify presence, telling people why they are here, why they matter, and why their place in the world is legitimate, turning inheritance into meaning and memory into foundation. The listener begins to sense that history functions less like a record and more like a mirror, something people look into not only to see what happened, but to see themselves, searching for reflections of values they recognize, struggles they admire, and triumphs they feel proud of, looking for ancestors who make sense of them, and through that, shaping a story that connects the present to something larger than itself. This is why some histories feel safe and others feel threatening, because a history that affirms belonging feels comforting, while a history that complicates belonging feels unsettling. And a history that reinforces identity feels like support, while a history that questions identity feels like erosion. So people naturally gravitate towards stories that stabilize them and away from those that destabilize them, not because they are dishonest, but because they are human. Identity is not built on neutrality, but on meaning, and meaning is not indifferent. It chooses what to hold and what to let fade, selecting which memories become central and which become peripheral, highlighting certain paths while dimming others, elevating some narratives and leaving others quiet. This selection is rarely conscious. It is emotional, as people hold close what makes them feel coherent and let go of what makes them feel uncertain. And in this way, history is protected not only by institutions but by individuals, through conversations, traditions, and memory, through the stories passed to children, the holidays that are celebrated, and the phrases repeated about where one comes from and what it means. These are not acts of control but acts of care, Yet care can become constraint when a story becomes essential to identity, because changing it then feels like loss, revising it feels like betrayal, and questioning it feels like attack, even when the inquiry is gentle, because it touches something people use to feel whole. Some histories become guarded not because they are false, but because they are fragile. Fragile not in their accuracy, but in their function, as they hold people together, give coherence to communities, give dignity to suffering, give pride to survival, and give continuity to time. And when history is asked to carry this much emotional weight, it cannot move freely, becoming careful and slow to change. Every revision is felt not only as a change in knowledge, but as a change in meaning, evaluated not only for what it adds, but for what it threatens to take away. So some stories change quickly, while others do not. Some memories are flexible, while others are sacred, and some questions feel welcome, while others feel unwelcome, even before they are spoken. Not because someone has forbidden them, but because everyone senses what is at stake. Identity is not something people simply have. It is something they maintain, something they care for, something they protect, and history becomes part of that protection as a form of emotional architecture that helps people live inside themselves and their world with less fear. This is why changing history can feel dangerous even when it is honest, because it can feel like removing a wall from a house while someone is still living in it, making the structure more open and accurate, but also less familiar and stable. And familiarity is not trivial, because it is the ground of psychological safety. The listener begins to feel compassion, rather than judgment, toward those who resist historical change, understanding that they are not resisting knowledge, but the loss of something that helps them feel real, connected, and at home. Which is why the story now moves toward what happens when history does change, and identity must shift with it. Because if history supports identity, then changing it becomes emotionally risky, and that risk is what quietly shapes the politics of memory. The past is not only something that is remembered, it is something that is organized, shaped, and carried forward in ways that make the present feel coherent. Every society needs a sense of continuity in order to function, a sense that it did not appear from nowhere, and is not moving toward nowhere. And history provides that continuity by offering a story of origin, development, and meaning that people can live inside. This is not manipulation in its dramatic sense, but something quieter and more human. Storytelling at scale, the collective effort to hold a shared narrative that allows millions of people to imagine themselves as part of a single unfolding story, rather than as isolated individuals moving through unrelated time. Governments and institutions naturally become stewards of this shared story, not because they seek to control memory, but because memory itself requires structure in order to remain stable. Archives must be kept, curricula must be designed, museums must choose what to display, anniversaries must be marked, and public language must settle around certain interpretations, rather than endlessly reopening every question. In this way, history becomes a resource that supports continuity, helping societies preserve identity, legitimacy, and trust in their own coherence. A population that knows where it came from feels less anxious about where it is going, and that emotional grounding is not trivial. It is the psychological infrastructure of social order. The listener begins to sense that some versions of the past are easier to govern with than others, not because they are more true, but because they are more usable. A past that offers clear heroes, shared struggles, and meaningful sacrifices gives people a sense of purpose and belonging. A past that is fragmented, contradictory, or unresolved creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is harder to organize around. So narratives that feel whole are favored over narratives that feel broken. Narratives that feel dignifying are favored over narratives that feel unsettling, and narratives that offer moral clarity are favored over narratives that ask difficult questions without offering comfort in return. This does not mean that history is falsified, but that it is curated, selected, and framed in ways that allow it to function as a social anchor rather than as a field of endless tension. Complexity is not removed, but it is softened. Contradiction is not denied, but it is managed. Ambiguity is not forbidden, but it is limited. The result is a version of the past that can be taught, commemorated, and referenced without constantly reopening wounds or destabilizing identity. The past becomes not a raw archive of everything that happened, but a narrative form of what can be held together. The listener begins to understand that this management is not driven by cynicism, but by a desire for stability. A society constantly questioning its own foundations cannot easily coordinate, cannot easily trust itself, cannot easily imagine a shared future. So memory becomes something that is not only remembered, but maintained, protected from too much fracture, too much doubt, too much openness, because openness is emotionally demanding, and coherence is emotionally soothing. In this way, the past becomes a political resource, not because it is exploited, but because it is needed. It provides legitimacy to institutions, continuity to communities, and meaning to collective life. It helps people feel that their sacrifices mattered, that their suffering was not meaningless, that their identity has roots and therefore weight. Without that sense of rootedness, power feels arbitrary and belonging feels fragile, so history becomes the soft ground beneath authority, not as a weapon, but as a foundation. Yet every foundation excludes something. In order for a story to feel whole, some threads must be backgrounded. In order for a narrative to feel stable, some questions must remain quiet. This is not an act of erasure so much as an act of selection, but selection shapes memory just as surely as deletion does. Over time, what is repeatedly told becomes what feels real, and what is rarely told becomes what feels distant, optional, or irrelevant, even if it is not. The listener begins to feel that this is why alternative histories feel inconvenient rather than dangerous. They do not threaten power directly. They threaten coherence. They reopen what has been settled. They ask what has been decided to rest. They complicate what has been made simple enough to live with, and that complication does not feel like liberation. It feels like work. It asks people to carry more, to hold more, to question more, and not everyone wants to do that. So the past is not only remembered, it is managed, not in order to deceive, but in order to sustain a shared sense of reality that people can inhabit together. And once that is seen, the listener understands why alternative histories are not suppressed loudly, but sidelined quietly. Because if history is a resource that supports order, then histories that disturb that order are not enemies, they are burdens. And burdens are what systems are built to minimize. And that is why the story moves next, toward what happens to the histories that do not fit easily inside this shared structure. Because if history is managed, then alternative histories become inconvenient. And inconvenience is the most powerful form of disappearance of all. Some discoveries do not threaten laws or institutions directly. They threaten the emotional architecture that allows those laws and institutions to feel natural. They reach backward into the stories people use to explain themselves and pull on them just enough to make the present feel less stable. When a piece of the past no longer fits the shape of the present, the discomfort is not intellectual first, but emotional, because the present is built on the assumption that the past supports it. If that support begins to feel uncertain, everything above it feels lighter, less anchored, less inevitable. The listener begins to sense that this is why certain truths feel like erosion rather than revelation. They do not simply add information, they remove ground. They do not offer something new to stand on. They loosen what was already there. A timeline that shifts slightly can disturb a sense of progress. A hierarchy that turns out to be younger than believed can disturb a sense of legitimacy. A culture that appears less isolated than imagined can disturb a sense of uniqueness. None of these changes are violent, but all of them are unsettling, because they change not what we know, but what we rely on. This is how the past becomes psychologically dangerous. It does not threaten power by force. It threatens meaning by reconfiguration. It asks people to reconsider not just facts, but frameworks. It invites them to see their world not as the natural outcome of history, but as one possible arrangement among many. And possibility is destabilizing, because it implies that what exists did not have to exist this way, and what exists now may not last. The listener begins to feel how heavy this implication can be. If the present is not inevitable, then neither is identity, nor authority, nor belonging. All of these become provisional rather than permanent, chosen rather than given, constructed rather than inherited. That realization is not abstract, it is intimate. It reaches into how people understand themselves, their place, their worth, and their future. So some truths feel threatening, not because they are extreme, but because they are subtle. They do not declare that something is wrong. They suggest that something could be otherwise. They do not attack. They invite reconsideration. And reconsideration is effort. It is the work of loosening one's grip on familiar meanings before new ones are ready to take their place. The listener begins to sense that this is why the past can feel like it is pressing against the present, not from behind, but from below. It shifts foundations rather than walls. It asks people to stand differently rather than move elsewhere. It does not demand change. It reveals that change has already happened many times before, and that revelation makes the present feel less solid, less fixed, less guaranteed. In this way, truth can feel like erosion, not destruction, but wearing away, not collapse, but thinning. It slowly softens the edges of certainty until what once felt firm becomes flexible, and flexibility can feel like weakness when one is used to stability. So the listener begins to understand why some discoveries fade, not because they are false, but because they are too real. They reach too close to what people are standing on. They touch assumptions that are doing important emotional work. They complicate identities that are holding communities together. And in doing so, they feel like they are taking something away, even when they are only revealing something new. This is why resistance to certain pasts does not look like censorship. It looks like hesitation. It looks like delay. It looks like careful language. It looks like a preference for interpretations that preserve continuity over interpretations that introduce uncertainty. It looks like choosing the version of the past that allows the present to remain comfortable. The listener begins to feel that remembering, in this context, is not a neutral act. It is a choice to allow the present to be reshaped by what is revealed, a choice to let identity become more fluid, authority more contingent, and belonging more complex. That choice does not feel heroic. It feels risky. It feels like stepping onto ground that may shift. And that is why remembering can become resistance, not because it opposes something, but because it refuses to allow the present to remain unquestioned. It insists that what exists is not the only way things can be, that what feels natural is often historical, and that what feels permanent is often temporary. This insistence is quiet, but it is powerful, because it keeps the future open. And that is where the story moves next, into the space where remembering is no longer only reflection, but action. Because when the past threatens the present, to remember is not simply to look back, but to gently loosen what has been held too tightly for too long. Even when stories are no longer told loudly, they rarely disappear completely. They soften, they scatter, and they lose their central place. But they remain in quieter forms, carried in small human ways rather than large institutional ones. They live in local memory, in family stories passed from one generation to another, in half-remembered songs, in place names whose meanings are no longer fully understood, in notebooks tucked into drawers, in letters that were never meant for publication, in photographs without captions, and in collections gathered not by professionals, but by people who simply felt that something mattered, even if they could not fully explain why. And in this way, survival does not look like preservation so much as persistence. The listener begins to sense that truth does not always travel through official channels, that sometimes it moves sideways, slipping into margins, finding shelter in places that are too small to attract attention and too personal to be regulated. A retired teacher keeps a stack of old articles because a question never quite settled. A local elder repeats a story that never made it into books because it did not fit the language of its time. A researcher keeps a private journal that records doubts never felt safe enough to publish. And a collector gathers objects museums overlooked, but that still seemed meaningful. And none of these people are trying to resist anything. They are simply holding what they do not want to lose. This holding is not dramatic or heroic, but gentle and ordinary, the act of keeping something nearby, of refusing to let it vanish entirely, of allowing it to remain part of the world, even if only in a small way. Memory, when it is not allowed to speak publicly, changes character, becoming quieter but more intimate, moving from the public to the personal, from the official to the private, from the visible to the felt, and in that movement it becomes less about authority and more about care, less about proof and more about presence, less about convincing and more about carrying. The listener begins to feel a soft form of hope here, not the hope of resolution but the hope of continuity, the sense that what matters does not always depend on being recognized, that meaning does not require permission, and that truth does not need a platform in order to exist. It can wait, it can rest, and it can remain incomplete, and still be real. And this waiting is not passive but patient, like seeds beneath the soil, unseen but alive, like stories that outlive the moments that first gave them shape, like knowledge that does not insist on being heard, but remains available when someone is ready to listen. Fragments feel powerful not because they are whole, but because they endure. They survive in pieces, hints, traces, and echoes. And those pieces are enough to keep a story from dying entirely, enough to keep a question from closing, enough to keep a possibility from being forgotten. Survival does not look like triumph, but like quiet continuity, like something being carried forward without guarantee, like someone choosing not to throw something away, like someone choosing to remember even when remembering has no audience. And in that sense, fragments are not weak, but resilient, moving through time not as monuments, but as threads that reappear when conditions change, when language shifts, when curiosity returns, and when someone finally asks the question that has been waiting. This is how the past stays alive when it cannot be public. It becomes relational rather than institutional, a shared whisper rather than a broadcast voice, something passed hand to hand and heart to heart rather than declared from above. And in this way, silence does not destroy truth but shelters it, protecting it from pressures that might distort or crush it, allowing it to remain itself rather than be reshaped into something easier to manage. Waiting is not emptiness but readiness, readiness for a different time, a different listener, a different world. And so fragments matter because they are not the end of the story but its memory, its breath between words, what remains when everything else has been set aside. And because fragments survive, someone must be carrying them, and that someone becomes part of the story simply by refusing to let what mattered become nothing, which is why the story now moves toward the people who carry what could not be kept anywhere else. Not all memory is kept by institutions, and not all preservation happens through archives, museums, or official records. Some of the most enduring forms of remembering live inside people, inside their habits, their stories, their collections, and their quiet sense that something should not be allowed to disappear, even if it no longer fits easily into the world around it. These people do not think of themselves as guardians or protectors. They think of themselves as caretakers, as listeners, as those who simply did not want to let something go. They are archivists who keep materials long after funding disappears, locals who remember stories that were never written down, descendants who carry fragments of family history that never entered public memory, and hobbyists who collect what others discard because it still feels meaningful to them. They are not driven by opposition or resistance, but by attachment, by a sense that certain things deserve continuity simply because they mattered once and therefore still matter now. Their work is not loud. It does not demand recognition. It does not insist on being right. It simply keeps. The listener begins to feel a quiet gratitude for this kind of presence, for the people who remain with what is fragile rather than what is celebrated, who stay close to what is incomplete rather than what is finished, and who offer care where there is no reward except the knowledge that something has been held rather than lost. This is not the preservation of power or prestige, but the preservation of texture, nuance, and human experience that would otherwise dissolve into generality. In this way, remembering becomes an act of care rather than an act of control. It is not about shaping the future or correcting the present, but about honoring what has been, allowing it to remain part of the world even if only in small ways. It is a form of emotional continuity, a bridge between moments that would otherwise be cut apart by time, a way of saying that what happened still matters because it still lives somewhere. The listener begins to sense that this kind of remembering does not feel heavy or burdensome. It feels gentle. It feels like tending something small and living rather than building something large and permanent. It feels like watering a plant rather than constructing a monument. It is slow, patient, and deeply human, and it does not seek to win or to persuade, but simply to keep something alive long enough for it to be met again. These keepers of memory do not always know who that future listener will be. They do not know when or whether what they hold will become relevant again. They do not even know if it will be understood. They only know that it felt wrong to let it vanish entirely, and that feeling was enough. So they keep the journal, the artifact, the story, the letter, the photograph, the song, and in doing so, they extend the life of something that might otherwise have ended quietly and without witness. The listener begins to feel that this is how truth survives when it cannot be public. It does not argue. It does not insist. It waits inside care. It lives inside people who choose not to abandon what feels meaningful, even when there is no audience and no validation. In this way, truth becomes relational rather than institutional, something passed through trust rather than through authority, something held in hands rather than written in stone. And because of that, this kind of memory is resilient. It is not dependent on approval or alignment. It does not need to be believed in order to exist. It only needs to be carried, and carried gently, so that it does not harden into dogma or disappear into forgetfulness. It remains flexible, alive, and open, able to meet new contexts without breaking or being forced into rigid shapes. The listener begins to sense that this is why remembering feels like care rather than conflict. It is not an attempt to challenge or correct, but an attempt to remain present with what was and what still is, to acknowledge that time does not erase meaning, even when it changes form. It is a way of saying that the past is not finished simply because it is no longer loud. And this is why memory, when carried this way, eventually finds listeners, not through force, but through resonance, not through insistence, but through readiness, not through power, but through timing. The stories that are held in care wait until someone is ready to hear them, until the world has shifted enough to make space for them, until a question finally appears that they can answer. And that is where the story moves next, into the moment when what has been quietly carried is finally met, and what has been kept in care is finally received. The stories that wait do not wait forever. They wait for conditions, for listeners, for a moment when the world becomes quiet enough, curious enough, or open enough to hear what was once too subtle, too complicated, or too inconvenient to hold. And when that moment arrives, the stories do not return as they were, but in new forms through new voices, carried by new people who are often unaware of how long those stories have been waiting to be spoken again. Modern platforms have quietly changed this by creating spaces where stories no longer need permission to exist, where a person no longer needs institutional backing or cultural authority to share what they have found, but only a way to speak and someone willing to listen. And through podcasts, documentaries, independent research, personal archives made public, and small communities formed around shared curiosity, forgotten material finds pathways back into the world. This return does not feel like rebellion but like circulation, as stories that were once held privately move outward again, not as declarations but as invitations. As someone tells a story because it mattered to them, someone else hears it because it resonates, a conversation forms, a question reopens, and a fragment finds a home. What once moved from public to private now moves from private to shared. What once softened into silence now gathers sound again, not as noise but as presence. And this movement feels less like disruption and more like continuity, allowing what was carried quietly to become part of a shared space again, not because it must be known by everyone, but because it no longer needs to be hidden inside only a few. The listener begins to sense that this return feels different from the original telling, because it is gentler, slower, less confident, and more careful, offering itself as possibility rather than declaring itself as truth, inviting attention rather than demanding belief. Attention becomes the new form of care, and when someone listens without needing to own, considers without needing to conclude, and shares without needing to persuade, the story is not used but held, and in being held it is allowed to breathe rather than to perform. This is why the return of forgotten stories feels less like disruption and more like healing, because the stories are no longer trying to change the world, but simply to be part of it again, and the listener begins to feel a quiet readiness in this, a sense that perhaps the world has changed enough to hold what it once could not, that perhaps people have become more patient, more open, more willing to sit with complexity rather than rush toward closure, not everywhere and not always, but enough for some stories to come back, enough for some questions to be asked again, enough for some fragments to find their listeners. The past in this movement becomes less like a foundation and more like a companion, less like an authority and more like a voice, less like a weight and more like a conversation. And conversations do not demand resolution but invite relationship. Readiness in this sense is not about knowledge, but about posture, about being able to listen without needing to defend, to consider without needing to control, to remember without needing to protect, about becoming spacious enough to hold more than one story at a time. This spaciousness does not belong to institutions but to people, to individuals who choose to listen, to communities that choose to share, to cultures that choose to remain curious. And the listener begins to feel that this is the quiet hope at the heart of the cycle, that what was once lost is not gone, what was once silenced is not dead, and what was once too heavy is not always too heavy, but was only waiting for a moment when the world could hold it differently. And now that it has returned, the question is no longer whether it should be remembered, but how we hold it, how we live with it, how we let it shape us without letting it harden us, how we let it open us without letting it overwhelm us. Because if stories are returning, then what we do with them matters more than ever, and that is the final space the story leaves open. The story now turns gently away from what has already faded and toward what is quietly forming in the present, because the same patterns that allowed earlier discoveries to soften into silence have not disappeared. They have simply become part of the background of how attention moves. They do not operate as decisions or commands, but as tendencies, as preferences that guide what feels interesting, fundable, publishable, and safe. In this way, the future's forgotten discoveries are not waiting somewhere in the distance. They are being shaped now, through what is noticed, what is supported, and what is quietly passed over. The listener begins to sense that modern archaeology, like all fields of inquiry, does not unfold in a vacuum. It moves within currents of funding, technology, politics, and public interest that subtly guide which questions feel alive and which feel heavy. Some questions are attractive because they promise clear answers, compelling visuals, or stories that can be easily told and easily received. They fit into familiar frames of progress, heroism, or discovery. They move forward without disturbing what is already believed. Other questions feel different. They open into uncertainty rather than resolution. They lead into complexity rather than clarity. They resist being summarized, simplified, or celebrated, and because of that resistance, they feel harder to carry. So attention gathers where movement feels easy. Funding flows where outcomes feel legible. Interest grows where stories feel coherent. And slowly, without anyone needing to decide it, certain paths become well lit while others grow dim. The listener is guided to notice this not as a problem, but as a pattern, something that arises naturally from the way human systems manage effort and expectation. We are drawn to what we can finish, what we can name, what we can resolve. We are less drawn to what remains open, what complicates, what refuses to settle. And because of that, the questions that survive are often the ones that promise closure, while the questions that fade are often the ones that promise depth. The listener begins to feel that this is how neglect works. It is not an act of removal, but an act of omission. It is not about pushing something away, but about never quite reaching for it in the first place. Remote regions with limited funding remain unexplored, not because they are unimportant, but because they are distant, complex, and resource-intensive. Topics that cross many disciplines remain under-examined, not because they are wrong, but because they do not belong cleanly anywhere. Questions that lead into ambiguity remain unanswered, not because they are forbidden, but because they do not offer the satisfaction of completion. And in this way, the future's forgotten discoveries are not hidden. They are simply unattended. They exist in places without audiences, in questions without frameworks, in spaces where curiosity has no immediate reward. The listener begins to sense the quiet sadness of this, not as loss but as potential that has not yet found its moment. The world is full of things that are waiting to be seen, not because they are hidden, but because they do not yet fit what we know how to look for. The tools we build shape the questions we ask. The stories we prefer shape the paths we follow, and so some questions remain invisible, not because they are small, but because they are unfamiliar. This is why the tone here is not critical, but reflective. There is no one to blame and no system to accuse. This is simply how attention moves when guided by efficiency, clarity, and comfort. It is how knowledge organizes itself when it is asked to be useful, marketable, and manageable at the same time. The listener begins to feel a quiet invitation here, not to change the world, but to notice it differently, to pay attention not only to what is being explored, but to what is not only to what is celebrated, but to what is absent, not only to what feels important, but to what feels too complex, too uncertain, or too subtle to be pursued. because those are often the places where something new is forming. And that formation is happening now. It is happening in the edges of fields, in the margins of funding, in the overlaps between disciplines, in the quiet work of people asking questions that do not yet have homes. So when the listener hears that the next forgotten discovery may be happening right now, unnoticed, they begin to understand that this is not a warning but an awareness, a way of seeing the present not as settled but as in motion, not as complete but as unfinished, not as something we inhabit but as something we are shaping simply by where we look and where we do not. And this is where the story gently points next, because if some questions are being avoided, the next thing to understand is why certain questions feel safer than others, and how safety itself becomes one of the strongest forces shaping what we are allowed to know. Human beings are not drawn first to what is most accurate, but to what is most bearable. And so we move towards stories that feel whole, that give us a sense of shape and direction, that allow us to rest inside them without feeling unsettled or incomplete. A simple story offers this rest by presenting a clear beginning, a clear middle, and a clear end, giving us heroes and causes, rises and falls, origins and outcomes, allowing us to feel that the world is understandable, that time moves in a meaningful direction, and that events, however complex they once were, can now be held in a form that feels stable and finished. The listener begins to sense how emotionally soothing this is, how a clean timeline feels like order, a neat origin feels like grounding, and a clear rise and fall feels like purpose. How these shapes take the overwhelming variety of experience and turn it into something we can carry, giving us a way to remember without being flooded, and to understand without being consumed, turning chaos into coherence and uncertainty into narrative, and in doing so, creating a sense of calm that is not intellectual but psychological. More complex stories feel different because they do not settle and refuse to stay within boundaries, blurring beginnings and endings, mixing causes and consequences, showing continuity where rupture was expected and rupture where continuity was assumed, leaving questions open, resisting summary, feeling alive rather than finished. And because they are alive, they demand attention, patience, and emotional energy. They do not allow us to rest but ask us to stay awake. The listener begins to feel that this is why complexity is tiring, not because it is wrong but because it is demanding, because it asks us to hold contradictions, to tolerate ambiguity, to accept that some things do not resolve cleanly, to live without closure. And living without closure requires strength, a willingness to remain open when we would rather be settled, to remain curious when we would rather be comforted, and to remain attentive when we would rather be soothed. So we choose simplicity, not out of ignorance or carelessness, but out of care, because we care for ourselves by choosing what we can live with, choosing stories that feel complete, because incompleteness feels exhausting, choosing stories that feel coherent, because incoherence feels disorienting, choosing stories that feel meaningful because meaninglessness feels frightening, and in this way, forgetting becomes a form of shelter, not an act of loss, but an act of protection, allowing us to place down what is heavy, close what is open, soften what is sharp, and continue living without being constantly pulled apart by what we cannot resolve. The listener begins to sense the quiet kindness in this, that forgetting is not always a failure of memory but sometimes a success of survival, the mind choosing what it can carry and what it must release in order to remain whole, the emotional body protecting itself from overload, and yet every shelter has a cost. Because when we choose rest, we choose not to move. When we choose comfort, we choose not to stretch. When we choose closure, we choose not to explore. And so simplicity gives us peace, but also gives us boundaries, gives us a place to stand, but limits how far we can see, gives us meaning, but limits how much meaning we can hold. The listener begins to feel this tension not as conflict but as balance, that we need simple stories in order to live, and complex stories in order to grow, that we need rest in order to survive, and effort in order to understand. So the question is not whether we should have simple stories or complex ones, but how often we allow ourselves to move between them, how often we leave the shelter and return to the field, how often we choose to be unsettled in order to be expanded. And this is why remembering feels like effort, because it requires us to reopen what we closed, lift what we set down, and feel what we softened. And because of that, remembering is not always easy or pleasant, but a form of work, and perhaps also a form of courage. The courage to hold more than one story, to live without complete closure, and to stay present with what does not yet make sense, which is why the story now moves toward what it means to choose that effort. Because if forgetting is a form of rest, then remembering becomes a form of effort, and effort is always a choice. Responsibility does not always arrive as a command or a demand. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling, as a gentle awareness that something matters simply because it has been noticed. In this sense, noticing is not passive. It is the first movement of care, the moment when something enters attention and therefore enters relationship. The listener begins to sense that to notice is not to judge or to fix or to act, but to allow something to exist fully in awareness, and that this allowance is already a form of participation. When a story feels incomplete, when a narrative feels too smooth, when an explanation settles too easily, something inside us often recognizes that, before the mind does. There is a subtle sense of absence, a quiet feeling that there is more here than is being said. To notice that feeling is not to accuse or to correct, it is simply to remain present with it rather than turning away. And remaining present is not nothing. It is a way of saying that what is unfinished still belongs. The listener begins to feel how rare this kind of presence is in a world that constantly asks for speed, clarity, and resolution. We are trained to move on quickly, to prefer answers to questions, and to close what feels open. Noticing asks the opposite. It asks us to slow down. It asks us to stay with what does not yet make sense. It asks us to tolerate a little uncertainty without rushing to relieve it. And this tolerance is not heavy, it is quiet. It does not demand effort so much as patience. The listener begins to sense that this is how remembering begins. Not with action, but with attention. Not with declaration, but with listening. Not with changing the world, but with allowing the world to be a little larger inside us than it was before. In this way, remembering is not something we do to the past, it is something we allow the past to do to us. It changes the shape of our understanding not by force, but by presence. This is why the invitation here is gentle rather than urgent. There is no call to fight institutions, no demand to correct history, no pressure to carry heavy truths. There is only the invitation to notice when something feels unfinished, to listen when something feels quiet, to remain open when something resists being simple. This openness is not loud. It does not draw attention. It does not claim authority. It simply creates space. And space is where complexity can live. The listener begins to feel that by noticing, they are already participating in the life of memory. They are becoming one of the places where a story can rest, where a question can remain open, where a fragment can remain alive. This is not a burden. It is a gift. It is the gift of being someone who can hold more than one version of a story, more than one layer of meaning, more than one possibility at a time. This holding does not require certainty. It does not require knowledge. It does not require proof. It requires only care. The care to listen without needing to conclude. The care to attend without needing to control. The care to remember without needing to own. In this way, noticing becomes a quiet form of courage. Not the courage of confrontation, but the courage of openness. Not the courage of speech, but the courage of listening. Not the courage of certainty, but the courage of not knowing and remaining present anyway. The listener begins to feel that this is enough, that the world does not need more noise, but more attention, that history does not need more arguments, but more listeners, that truth does not need more defenders, but more places where it can be held without being rushed or reshaped. So the responsibility here is not heavy. It is light enough to carry in ordinary life. It lives in moments of reading, listening, walking, noticing, wondering. It lives in the pause before accepting a story as complete. It lives in the question that remains unasked, but not forgotten. And this is where the story gently turns toward its final movement, because if noticing is the first step, then the final step is not action but carrying, not speaking but holding, not changing the world, but allowing ourselves to be changed by what we have noticed. And understanding what it means to carry a story forward is where the story finally comes to rest. Remembering is often imagined as storage, as if the past were a collection of objects that could be placed on shelves, labeled, and kept unchanged over time. But this way of thinking misses something essential about how memory actually works in human life. We do not keep the past. We meet it. We do not hold it still. We encounter it again and again from wherever we are now, and each encounter reshapes what it means. Memory is not a container, but a relationship. And like all relationships, it is alive, responsive, and changing. The listener begins to feel that the past is not behind us in a simple sense. It is alongside us, moving with us, appearing differently depending on who we have become and what we are able to notice. A story heard in childhood feels different when heard again in adulthood. An event once remembered with pride can later be remembered with sorrow, or with understanding, or with forgiveness. The facts may remain the same, but the meaning does not, because meaning lives in the space between what happened and who is remembering. This is why remembering cannot be reduced to accuracy alone. Accuracy matters, but it is not sufficient. We can know something precisely and still not understand it. We can record something perfectly and still not relate to it. Relationship requires attention, presence, and care. It requires us to listen not only to what is being said, but to how it is being felt. And that listening changes us. The listener begins to sense that memory is more like a conversation than a record. It speaks to us, and we respond to it, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with resistance, sometimes with grief, sometimes with gratitude. Over time, this conversation deepens. We hear new layers. We notice what we missed before. We ask different questions than we once did. The past does not change, but our relationship to it does, and that change is not a flaw in memory, it is its life. In this way, the past is less like a museum and more like a living presence. A museum holds things apart from us, behind glass, protected from touch and from change. A relationship invites touch, invites change, invites vulnerability. It allows us to be affected. And being affected is not a failure of objectivity. It is the condition of meaning. The listener begins to feel that when we insist on treating the past only as an object, we protect ourselves from it. We keep it at a distance. We turn it into something that cannot reach us, or challenge us, or reshape us. This distance feels safe. It feels controlled. But it also limits what the past can offer, because the deepest things the past can give us are not information but perspective, not data but insight, not certainty but understanding. So remembering as relationship is an invitation rather than a task. It is an invitation to listen rather than to collect, to attend rather than to archive, to remain open rather than to finish. It does not ask us to know everything, but to care enough to keep listening. The listener begins to sense that this kind of remembering is not about mastery but about humility. It is the recognition that the past is larger than any one interpretation and deeper than any one story, and that we will never exhaust its meaning. There will always be more to hear, more to feel, more to understand, and this is not a problem to solve but a reality to live with. This is why remembering can feel intimate. It touches us where we are vulnerable, where we are uncertain, where we are changing. It asks us to let ourselves be shaped by what we encounter, rather than to remain unchanged observers. And this shaping is not imposed, it is invited. The listener begins to feel that remembering is not about preserving something static, but about participating in something ongoing. It is not about holding the past in place, but about holding ourselves in relation to it. It is not about fixing meaning, but about allowing meaning to continue unfolding. And this unfolding is not endless in a burdensome way. It is endless in the way a conversation is endless, in the way love is endless, in the way understanding is endless. There is always another layer, another angle, another way of seeing, and that is not a failure of closure but a sign of depth. So when the listener hears that remembering is not about holding the past but listening to it, they begin to understand that listening is an active, living posture. It requires attention, patience, and care. It asks us to show up again and again, not to extract something, but to be present. And this is where the story now moves. Because if memory is a relationship, then it does not leave us unchanged. It shapes who we become, how we see, and how we live, and understanding that transformation is the final movement of the story. When we engage with the past as something living rather than finished, something relational rather than distant, it does not remain outside us, it enters us. It settles into how we think, how we feel, how we judge, and how we understand ourselves and others. The listener begins to sense that remembering is not an act that leaves the world unchanged, but an act that reshapes the one who remembers, slowly and quietly, through exposure to stories that complicate certainty and expand perspective. As forgotten or complex histories come into awareness, they soften the edges of what once felt obvious. They introduce nuance where there was clarity, ambiguity where there was simplicity, and depth where there was flatness. This does not weaken understanding, it deepens it. It allows us to see that most human stories are layered rather than linear, shaped by many forces rather than one, and that behind every event there are many voices, many experiences, and many interpretations. The listener begins to feel how this layering makes it harder to judge quickly and easier to listen carefully. Certainty has a weight to it. It presses the world into fixed shapes. It tells us what something is and what it is not, who is right and who is wrong, what matters and what does not. This weight can feel reassuring, but it can also feel limiting. When certainty softens, the world does not collapse into chaos. It opens into complexity. The listener begins to feel how this opening creates space for empathy, because when we no longer need stories to be simple, we become more willing to accept that people are not simple either. This is how uncertainty becomes a gift rather than a loss. It loosens rigid categories and allows understanding to move. It creates room for multiple perspectives to coexist without needing to cancel each other out. It invites us to see difference not as threat, but as texture, not as conflict, but as richness. And in doing so, it changes how we relate not only to the past, but to the present and to each other. The listener begins to sense that this transformation is not dramatic. It does not feel like a revelation or a conversion. It feels like a gradual shift, a quiet recalibration of how the world is perceived. It feels like becoming slightly more patient, slightly more curious, slightly more gentle in one's assumptions. It feels like the softening of edges rather than the breaking of structures. This is why the value of forgotten history is not only that it adds information, but that it adds depth. It does not simply tell us more, it asks us to become more. It does not simply inform us, it forms us. It shapes how we hold stories, how we hold people, how we hold ourselves. It invites humility by reminding us how partial our knowledge always is. It invites compassion by reminding us how complex human experience always has been. The listener begins to feel that engaging with the past in this way is a kind of ethical practice, not because it tells us what is right, but because it teaches us how to see. It trains attention. It trains patience. It trains the ability to live with complexity without needing to resolve it prematurely. And these are not small skills. They shape how we move through the world. When we are changed in this way, the change does not stay inside us. It appears in how we speak, how we listen, how we respond, how we choose. It appears in the questions we ask, and the ones we no longer rush to answer. It appears in the stories we tell and the way we tell them. It appears in the space we make for others to be complex too. The listener begins to sense that this is how the world is changed quietly. Not through declarations or movements, but through people who have been shaped by what they have remembered. People who are less certain and therefore more open, less rigid and therefore more responsive, less defensive and therefore more able to meet difference with curiosity rather than fear. This is not a heroic transformation. It is a subtle one. It happens in the background of life. It happens in moments of listening, in pauses of reflection, in choices made with a little more care than before. It happens in the way someone reads a story differently, hears a voice differently, or responds to a question differently than they once would have. And that is why the story now moves to its final quiet conclusion, because if remembering changes us, then it also changes the world through us, not by force but by presence, not by command but by example, not by making noise but by making space, and understanding that gentle movement is how the story finally comes to rest. The story does not move toward an ending so much as it moves toward a pause, the way a day moves toward evening, or a tide moves toward stillness. And nothing is finished here or resolved. There is no final answer waiting at the end of the path, no last door to open, no hidden room to enter, only a soft settling, a gradual quieting of motion, as if the story itself were exhaling after a long and careful breath. And the listener begins to feel this settling not as emptiness but as presence, As the questions that once carried the story forward do not disappear, but lose their urgency, no longer pulling or demanding, resting in the background like stars that remain even when the sky grows bright, so that the need to know becomes a space to be, and in that space there is room for something gentler than explanation. The narration returns to simple things, to breath moving in and out, to time moving forward without effort, to earth holding everything without asking to be noticed. And the world does not wait for stories to finish before it continues. Wind moves, light shifts, people walk and sleep and wake again. And the forgotten civilizations, the fading discoveries, and the quiet memories all become part of this larger movement that does not need to be understood in order to be lived. And the listener begins to feel that this is not disappearance, but integration. As the story becomes less like an object and more like an atmosphere, no longer standing in front of attention asking to be examined, but moving behind attention and becoming part of how the world is felt, part of how silence feels fuller, how questions feel kinder, how not knowing feels less like absence and more like openness. In this resting place, nothing needs to be carried forward as a conclusion. There is no message to remember, no lesson to repeat, no truth to defend, only awareness. The quiet sense that something has been noticed, that something has been held, that something has been allowed to exist without being forced into shape. And the listener begins to sense that this is enough, not because everything has been answered, but because nothing needs to be answered in order for the moment to be complete. So the mind can rest, the heart can soften, and the world can be allowed to be as wide and as quiet as it already is. The story does not end but rests, resting in the listener, resting in the questions that remain open, resting in the spaces that have been made a little larger by attention, resting in the gentle willingness to notice without needing to resolve, resting in the quiet courage to hold awareness without turning it into action or belief. And this resting is not passive, but a form of trust. Trust that meaning does not need to be grasped in order to be real. Trust that understanding does not need to be finished in order to be deep. Trust that the story can be carried simply by being allowed to live quietly inside someone. So there is no farewell here, no closing statement, no final word, only a return to breath, a return to time, a return to the ordinary world that has always been here and is always enough. And the story becomes part of that world now, not as something separate from it, but as something woven into it, like memory woven into identity, like silence woven into sound, like rest woven into motion. And in that weaving, nothing is lost, nothing is held too tightly, nothing is asked to be more than it is. The story does not disappear, it becomes part of what remains. And what remains is simply this moment, this breath, this quiet awareness that holds everything gently without needing to name it, and that is where the story rests.